You've tried everything. You bought that cheap $3 sugar bait from the store, placed it right in the ant's path, and waited for the colony to disappear in a few days. But then something strange happened. The ants walked right up to the bait. A few even touched it, and then kept moving as if it wasn't there at all. If you've ever experienced this, you know how frustrating it is. Because at that moment, it feels like you've done everything right. You researched the problem. You watched videos. You followed the advice of experts. And maybe, like me, your first reaction was to grab a can of spray and start killing every ant you could see. Honestly, it feels satisfying at first. The ants die. The counter looks clean. And you think, problem solved. But then, a day later, maybe 2 days later, the ants are back. They're crawling around the sink, marching across the kitchen counter, showing up from an entirely different corner of the house. And that's when you realize something isn't adding up. That's why so many people eventually switch from sprays to baiting. The idea sounds perfect. The ants eat the bait. They carry the poison back to the nest. The colony dies. Simple, at least in theory. But what happens when the ants won't even touch the bait? That's where most people get stuck. They assume the bait is defective. Maybe it's the wrong brand. Maybe these ants are somehow smarter than normal. But the real explanation is far more interesting. And it starts with the fact that most homeowners never realize. The ants you can see are not the real problem. Professional pest control technicians know something that most people don't. The ants wandering across your kitchen are only a tiny fraction of the colony. Think about that for a second. The 10 or 20 ants you can see may represent only a small scouting team. Meanwhile, hidden behind your walls, under your floors, or somewhere deep inside your property, there could be thousands more. Worker ants, developing larvae. And most importantly, the queen. In other words, the ants you're seeing are just the tip of the iceberg. The vast majority of the colony remains hidden and untouched. And if those visible ants aren't taking your bait, the colony behind the scenes continues to thrive. So the question becomes, why are they ignoring it? If ants are always searching for food, why would they walk past a free meal? The answer is the secret that separates successful ant control from endless frustration. Most people assume ants always want sugar, and sometimes that's true, but not all the time. Ant colonies don't crave the same food year-round. Their nutritional needs change depending on what's happening inside the nest. Sometimes the colony needs quick energy. When that happens, ants actively seek out sugary foods. But at other times, the colony is focused on growth. They're feeding larvae, raising the next generation, and building a stronger workforce. During those periods, they aren't looking for dessert. They're looking for dinner. They want protein. It's actually very similar to humans. Some days you're in the mood for cake. Other days you want a full meal. Ant colonies operate in much the same way. And if the colony is currently craving protein while you're offering only a sugar bait, that bait might be completely irrelevant to them. To the ants, it's like offering dessert when they're hungry for steak. That's why they walk right past it. That's why your bait sits untouched. And that's why so many people spend months fighting ants without realizing that the problem isn't the poison, it's the menu. The moment I learned this, everything changed. I realized that successful ant control isn't just about buying the strongest bait on the shelf. It's about understanding what the ants actually want at that specific moment. And in the next part, I'll show you a simple test that takes just a few minutes and can reveal whether your ants are looking for sugar or protein. One small discovery that can completely transform your ant control strategy. Closing, what you have just heard is not a life hack. It is not a fringe theory. It is documented science, confirmed by independent researchers across multiple countries, across more than a century of study, and validated by one of the most respected public health institutions in the world. A copper coil costs $2. It removes bacteria, parasites, and heavy metals. It requires no fuel, no cartridges, no supply chain. It lasts for hundreds of liters, and it has been available to anyone willing to look for it since the 19th century. The knowledge did not disappear because it failed. It faded because there was no financial incentive to keep it visible. Now you have it. And knowledge, once shared, does not go back into the dark. So what do you do when you've discovered that your ants are in a protein cycle and won't even look at a sugar bait? This is where one of the simplest and most talked about DIY ant control tricks comes into the picture. The best part? You don't need expensive equipment. You don't need a professional exterminator. And you don't need to spend $20 or $30 on specialty products. In fact, the entire bait can be made from just 2 inexpensive ingredients that most people can find at a local store for only a few dollars. The first ingredient is borax, a naturally occurring mineral commonly found in the laundry aisle. The second is creamy peanut butter. That's it. Just 2 ingredients. But here's where most people make a mistake. They hear borax and peanut butter and immediately start guessing the measurements. Unfortunately, when it comes to ant bait, guessing can completely ruin the strategy. Because the goal isn't to kill the first ant that takes a bite. The goal is to eliminate the colony. And those are 2 very different things. That's why the ratio matters so much. The commonly recommended mixture is 1 teaspoon of borax combined with 2 tablespoons of creamy peanut butter. Not a heaping teaspoon. Not 2 teaspoons. And definitely not a handful thrown into the mixture. The amount matters because the bait needs to work slowly. Think about what we're trying to accomplish. We don't want the worker ant to eat the bait and immediately collapse on your kitchen counter. If that happens, the mission has failed. Sure, one ant is gone, but the queen is still alive. The larvae are still growing. And thousands of ants hidden behind your walls may never come into contact with the bait at all. Instead, we want the worker ant to behave normally. We want her to find the food, take a portion back to the nest, share it with her nestmates, feed the developing larvae, and eventually allow some of that bait to reach the queen herself. That only happens when the toxicant acts slowly enough to turn the worker into an unwitting delivery system. In other words, the ant becomes the vehicle that transports the bait directly into the heart of the colony. And that's exactly why adding too much borax can actually make the bait less effective rather than more effective. The next important detail is the peanut butter itself. Believe it or not, texture matters. The bait should be made with creamy peanut butter, not crunchy peanut butter. That might sound like a minor detail, but it can make a difference. Remember, ants are tiny creatures with incredibly small mouthparts. They're not chewing through chunks of peanuts. They're collecting and consuming small amounts of soft, easy-to-handle food. If the mixture feels gritty, rough, or uneven, some ants may be less interested in feeding from it. That's why the mixture should be stirred thoroughly until every trace of the white borax powder disappears. You shouldn't be able to see white streaks. You shouldn't see little clumps. Everything should be blended into a smooth, uniform paste. The smoother the bait, the easier it is for the ants to consume and transport. But what exactly happens after the ants eat it? Why is borax so effective? The answer lies in how it affects the insect's digestive system. Borax is a naturally occurring mineral, and in bait formulations, it acts much differently than the instant kill sprays most people are familiar with. Instead of killing immediately, it works gradually. After the ant consumes the bait, the borax begins interfering with the insect's ability to properly process and utilize food. Over time, the digestive system can no longer function normally. The ant may continue eating, but it becomes increasingly unable to gain the nourishment it needs. In simple terms, the insect slowly starves from the inside out, even after feeding. And that delay is exactly what makes the strategy work. The worker ant remains active long enough to carry the bait back home. She continues interacting with other ants. She continues sharing food. And before the toxicant finally takes effect, the bait has already begun spreading through the colony's food-sharing network. That's the real power of this approach. You're not targeting the ants you can see, you're targeting the thousands you can't. And when everything works as intended, a mixture made from 2 simple ingredients can potentially reach far deeper into the colony than a spray ever could. But there's one final step that determines whether the ants actually find and accept the bait in the first place. And that's where placement becomes just as important as the recipe itself.